Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Robert Furnival, and I'm the Director of Alliances and Partnerships at Eden House. Eden House help forward-thinking businesses reimagine their business processes by harnessing the power of SAP innovation to help drive transformation. As a leading SAP Platinum partner, Eden House specializes in the sale, implementation, support, and hosting of SAP products and services. We have seen in recent years, we specialize in SAP, and we've seen in recent years that the portfolio has grown rapidly. And we realized that it wasn't possible for us to be able to be experts in all of those different solutions, and that we needed to partner with the experts in certain areas. Our webinar today is being presented by Andrew Sawyer from Winterhawk. We established a partnership with Winterhawk just over 2 years ago. And since then, they've been supporting Eden House clients across multiple industry sectors. Winterhawk are both part of the kinship partner ecosystem and also, like ourselves, a United VAR partner, providing expertise in security, GRC, identity, and access management for both SAP and non-SAP workloads. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to Andy, who's going to run the session for us.
Thanks, Rob, for the introduction. So just to cover off, so I'm Andy Sawyer. I am the Director of Operations at Winterhawk. And as stated by Rob, I'll be leading and driving today's session. At Winterhawk, we specialize in services related to SAP GRC, security, and identity management, with a high focus on the risk, regulatory governance, and control. In today's webinar, we'll discuss some of the ways to overcome challenges in identity and access management and how to minimize the risk of data loss, as well as audit failures and regulatory fines. We'll also take a look at some of the preferred solutions in the marketplace. We do have a live demonstration lined up today, which will focus on more about reducing the burden of access administration. And for those organizations who are already looking to migrate to S/4HANA in the future, we'll also close today's session by discussing some of the key steps for performing a secure implementation. So we'll kick off today by just looking at some of the latest research from the Ponemon Institute, as it really does paint a slightly concerning picture that regardless of the type of threat, whether it's a scam or a fraud, or whether it's an internal or external risk, risk is really flourishing right now and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. From an internal perspective, there are already millions of employees who have access to systems that house sensitive company data or they're processing transactions. And with so much access, it's really not a stretch to claim that the threat is even greater for those who are running our business versus the external forces, particularly in times of crisis. So we're all familiar with the GDPR, and most people probably feel like they've had some kind of GDPR fatigue over the last few years since it came into effect. However, one of the most common causes of non-compliance of GDPR is insufficient technical and organizational measures to ensure information security. And as you can see from the handful of recent GDPR fines handed out across the UK and EU this year, is that many organizations are still not doing enough to protect their own data, that of their employees, and also of their customers. And with many organizations already receiving the maximum penalty, which could be enforced for their non-compliance. So what we have here are some of the typical risks which organizations are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. However, clearly, there are many, many more, and some very unique to that particular organization. But it's actually not just the risk itself that causes the challenge. It's about how the organization treats the risk and responds to the risk. And in the majority of cases, organizations just suffer from a lack of internal visibility, proper ownership, or just a lack of a sustainable process to effectively manage and govern the risk. I mean, if we take auditor scrutiny, for example, Winterhawk, we work with many organizations who are reacting to negative audit remarks or concerns raised by their internal audit. But actually 9 times out of 10, the overall cost for remediation actually outweighs the initial implementation of bringing in a best practice to begin with. So among the many services which Winterhawk provide in the GRC space for both SAP and also non-SAP applications, today we're going to be focusing on 4 key areas and solutions. Now, the first one is going to be SAP UI logging and masking. Now, these are SAP solutions that provide added visibility and restriction on top of the standard authorization and security model, and allow you to really see what is actually going on in your landscape and what your users are actually accessing data-wise. We'll also be covering SAP Access Control. So it's probably a solution that many organizations are already very familiar with. It's been around for quite some time, and it enables visibility into access risk, and it provides that platform to support SAP identity management, as well as helping to perform controlled user provisioning. Now, the final solution, and what we're actually going to be performing a demonstration of today, is on ERP Maestro. And ERP Maestro is an access control equivalent application targeted at SAP systems for the smaller to mid-sized organization who are also looking to gain some control back within their SAP environment. And we'll take a closer look at the content and the features of that application today. So firstly, we're going to look at UI masking and logging, and that falls under the threat and the vulnerability section within SAP GRC. So what is SAP UI logging and masking? Well, they're typically considered to be one of the hidden gems, let's say, of SAP assurance, and they're often referred to as the speed limiter and the speed camera. So UI masking applies additional restriction for key data fields and key data elements within SAP, and manages who can view that data on an exception basis. Hence, it limits the views of a user when that user's already been provided to the transaction or the table or that area within SAP. UI logging works by allowing users to gain access to that data as part of their standard business purposes, standard business access. But what we'll do is, in identifying key data elements which are potentially sensitive, these could be transactions, they could be specific organizational entities or HR entities. What we can do is we can monitor any access to that data or to that transaction or organizational entity, and then that monitoring process logs everything that user has done whilst accessing the data. It's logged for them for follow-up. You can also build in things like workflow notifications for critical data purposes. So if someone accesses a key piece of data that they're perfectly entitled to, you might want to set up a notification to alert a key member of staff that someone's logged into this, and just to validate that it was what they actually were accessing at the time was fine. We also see it commonly used for audit assurance as well, where access has been provided to an end user, but actually it's more about just validating that what was done whilst using that access was appropriate, and that the access wasn't actually misused at the time. So for UI masking, the primary purpose is to prevent things like internal data leaks by applying this additional restriction on top of what we would consider sensitive or critical data. So if we took a basic example where we may have 10 users who all share a common role assignment, within via the normal security means, you might have a scenario where actually 1 or 2 of those users may need to see something on top of what the other 8 need to see. So what we can actually do is we can apply a logic that we give them access to the transaction, we give them access to be able to view that entity as part of their standard authorizations. But in applying the masking logic, when all 10 of them log in, actually 8 of them will see a masked field, especially if it's a sensitive thing. It could be in relation to basic pay or user's address, or it could just be in relation to key vendor or customer data as well. However, the 1 or 2 people that have been added to the exception list would see the full output of the transaction itself. Okay, so it really works in tandem with the existing SAP security and authorization model, but it adds that extra layer of protection on top of the standard, role-based governance, that we see applied, within SAP today. From a UI logging perspective, well, its focus is about allowing access to perform the activity, but adding that extra layer of visibility to support, business controls for inappropriate usage or the validation of what was accessed by a user. So as standard, the tool is actually capturing all activity performed by that user on that identified transaction. So if you set it on SE16, for example, then anytime a user is accessing that transaction, it's not just going to show you what was changed, it's actually going to show you what was displayed for the user on screen as well. What were the key fields, what were the data entry points that were that the user could actually see on screen, things like basic pay, for example. So it's not just the changed, it's also what was displayed. And as I said before, it's all about setting up those kind of workflows and notifications that when you're allowing your users to access sensitive data elements within SAP, having that ongoing assurance that there is nothing, that access is not being misused or being used inappropriate, so that can actually be assigned and provided to greater assurance. Now, in terms of the overall architecture of what we call UI data security, which is the header of UI masking and logging, so these are actually SAP add-ons to the existing SAP NetWeaver. So they're not standalone hosted solutions like an Access Control or other applications. They are installed onto the same platform where you want to perform the masking or where you want to perform the logging. Therefore, the actual installation is fairly straightforward, and the implementation itself is very low impact. And based on the experience that we have, there's actually very little impact on the overall system performance. You might think that we're creating lots of additional data, by logging all of this user activity, but we apply a strong archiving model so that we're not saving millions of lines worth of unusable data. It's about targeting the actual information that you need to see. So what we can actually see on screen here is just how SAP is treating that data. So if we have our SAP user, they're logging onto the system, they're running a particular transaction code, and normally that would go back, it would check on the database layer, it would then provide you with a response with the output that you're looking for if you've run a transaction and you put in your key values. So if you're using masking, what it's actually going to do is it's going to apply that rule to see, hang on, someone's accessing a transaction that is, we have our masking rules applied to, and then it will check the exception list, and then depending on the responses of who that user is, it will either display the data in full, or it will display the masked data. So just a very small example up here. We can see the kind of start dates of people and their type of their employment types, where that data would be masked, not just at a table level, but also in the UI. And this is applicable for both standard ECC, ERP systems, BW, but also for S4, and if you're accessing SAP via like a Fiori front end as well. Similarly with UI logging, what it's actually doing is, obviously we're not stopping anyone from accessing or seeing parts of the data. We're observing the data traffic, and if that traffic is foreseen to be something that we put an exception against, whether it's a critical piece of data or a critical transaction, we're going to create the temporary log, and we're going to store that for further usage in the future. So whether it's something we're just doing a analysis of the log, or we're actually setting up an alert that is then triggering workflow to notify someone that someone has accessed this data and that a review needs to actually take place. Okay, so that's typically how UI logging and UI masking are actually working within the SAP environment itself. So whistle stop of UI logging and masking, we're going to move on to SAP GRC and talk specifically about SAP Access Control. So probably most people, again, you know, a fairly common understanding of access control. That is the most popular SAP GRC product that SAP provide. Its primary purpose is for, you know, segregation of duty reporting, critical access, and risk analysis. Of course, as a bread and butter tool, there's a lot that can be done with the actual analysis of segregation of duties, the provisioning of, you know, firefighter access, so enhanced access privileges to users. But what it's probably not as commonly used as is for automating access requests and the necessary approvals for those access requests, whether it's about automating reviews of user access at a risk level or at a role level. You know, we see every organization who's using access control today is using it for a slightly different business purpose. One of the things that is becoming more popular with access control is about enhanced application automation. So this is about taking the standard, you know, out of the box content from access control and applying SAP intelligent RPA rules to it. So these are things that we can create these robotic automation processes for things like, you know, password self-service resets, automated access reviews, you know, creation and approval of access requests. So there's really no kind of limit to the types of automation that can be applied on top of the standard processes and features within access control. Now, in terms of who's using it, typically we do see large enterprises using access control because it is an enterprise solution, but we've also seen smaller and mid-sized organizations using it as well. However, for those smaller and mid-sized organizations, they may want to look at other more cost-effective solutions, you know, versus actual access control itself. So for those of you who already maybe have SAP access control, there is a new and improved version already available, which is version 12.0. If you're using version 5.3, then you're already out of SAP support. But at the end of the year, versions 10 and 10.1 will also go out of support. The latest release of version 12.0, it does offer a great deal of functionality updates, as well as just generally helping with system stability. If you're also looking to apply things like the Fiori front end, it really does improve the overall end user experience. And a lot of customers are obviously starting their migration today, but in doing so, looking at not just an out-of-the-box upgrade, but also improving on their business processes. They might be quite stale in the processes that have been applied, you know, 3, 4, 5 years old, some of these business processes. So it's not necessarily just about the technical upgrade. It's about looking at, can we improve our processes? Can we improve the end user experience for our users, not just our business users, but the people who are using the tool on a day-by-day basis? That might be IT, it might be internal controls. So that's just something to take into consideration in relation to looking at your upgrades for version 12.0. And of course, with the latest version, it does have a lot more integration with RPA tools. So I already mentioned about SAP Intelligent RPA, which is SAP's own kind of internal tool for robotics. However, for access control and other GRC applications, there are many other compatible tools as well that do offer, you know, the integration with SAP. These are things like Blue Prism or Automation Anywhere. So if your organizations are already using those software tools on other SAP platforms or for other activities, then they can also be applied onto SAP GRC as well. So moving on from access control, we're going to talk about ERP Maestro. So ERP Maestro differs from the classic SAP solutions like access control in that it is a subscription-based solution, which is hosted entirely in the cloud, securely, of course. And with it being a cloud-based solution, the installation, so the initial installation, can literally be performed in a matter of hours. And we've seen on most cases of implementation that an organization who's moving to ERP Maestro can actually start the review of their SAP risks and start, looking at where are my key areas, where is my business risk at the highest on the same day of implementation as well. So just a little bit of additional information about ERP Maestro. For me, one of the key features of ERP Maestro is in its risk definition and its rule set, which does differ somewhat to SAP's. However, it has been validated by the top global audit firms. So in terms of referencing, and if you have any pressure from audit about understanding access risk and the checks that you should be performing at access level, the rule set is already validated by those audit firms. Another key benefit is really the ease of use. I think in comparison to the likes of some of its competitors, that for people that are new to security governance and are really looking for some significant quick wins and be able to kind of transition this tool out into the business for their use, it is a very easy tool to kind of pick up, understand, and actually be able to find the elements that you're looking for and be presented with that data, rather than having to run multiple reports and do lots of additional analysis on top of the reports that you get out of the solution. And we'll look at some of those examples in our live demonstration today. It's also fully enabled for S/4HANA and also for SuccessFactors. So they actually released a new rule set, or this is a collection of SAP Access Risk last year, back in 2019, which does take into consideration things like the transaction simplification of S/4HANA, and it also includes Fiori privileges as well. So what is it? Because ERP Maestro is actually not the solution itself. ERP Maestro is the organization who has built these 4 solutions. So we have the Access Analyzer, Access Reviewer, Emergency Access, and Automated Provisioning. Now, all of these solutions can be deployed together as one, but also can be licensed individually or independently. So Access Analyzer is the core element of ERP Maestro's offering. So this is where we would typically have segregation of duty reporting, our ability to run sensitive transaction violations. We're capturing things about our transaction usage, our role usage, and this is also where it's going to provide us with our remediation advisory activities as well. We have the reviewer tool, which is it's a common requirement for things like SOX, but also just as general best practice that organizations should be reviewing, or at least continuing to review, the assignment of access to their end users. So one of the common problems that we see is a kind of snowball effect of users who have, maybe 5 years ago they received one role, they moved, they gained some new access, that was added, but nothing was removed, and that kind of continues that cycle until you actually end up with these, very powerful users that you don't really have any visibility of. So performing an access review, at least periodically, whether that's quarterly or yearly, just to establish is the right level of access assigned to our users is something that would be recommended by audit. And using Access Reviewer in here, it really does simplify that process and makes it easy, rather than having to pull out loads of different reports from SAP and then send everything via email to your approvers. It kind of collects the data, automates it, and actually sends out the workflows for notification. We also have emergency access, which you would consider as a firefighter equivalent within SAP. So this works slightly differently in that rather than having a separate user ID in your system that's giving you this enhanced authorizations, what it does is it adds new roles to your user for a period of time. There's obviously been initially approved, as well as once that you've performed your activity and the access has been deprovisioned on that temporary basis, a review process kicks into play. And we'll have a look at some of those examples again, in the demo, which we'll get onto very soon. And then the final one is automated provisioning. So not necessarily something you would send out to your entire business as a self-service, but more of a helpful tool for security teams, for service desks, and to help with the provisioning of access, and with built-in sort of workflow for approvals and risk analysis. So we're going to dive into our demonstration now. I hope everyone can still see. So as I mentioned before, ERP Maestro is a fully cloud-enabled solution. It's accessed via the internet, and we can see here app.erpmaestro.com. You have a unique login for your organization and for your user within your organization. And what we'll be greeted with first is the dashboard. So this is the main user dashboard that everyone would see. And there are some enhancements, which we're going to show later on in the session, which allow some further filtering on which users are actually being shown within the dashboard. Right now on this view, we're seeing all of our users, and we're seeing all of the risks that our users have within the organization. Now, the way that ERP Maestro is displaying its information, it's in three real key categories. So I'm a user, I have an access risk or a segregation of duty, combination of one or more transactions working together to allow me to do something potentially inappropriate in the system. Now, the way that ERP Maestro is presenting that data back is that, yes, I have the risk, but in those that are listed as green means that I have not executed either side of the segregation of duty. So if you have a transaction on the left that is conflicting with a transaction on the right, I actually might have access to them, but I've never actually used them. So that's what we generally consider as our remediation scope. These are things that should be cleared from the system because they're assigned to a user without any current usage. We then have our partially executed, which is where, let's say we have usage on the left, but no usage on the right. So again, should be considered as remediation scope because we can remove one half of the segregation of duty successfully without them losing any authorization that they need to perform the activities that they are. And then we have the red, which is that they're using both sides of the transaction. So we may consider that this is the most risky because they have the segregation of duty and they're actually performing transactions which would allow them to execute that segregation of duty as well. This is generally what is considered the mitigation scope, where if they're using the transactions frequently, we may not be able to remove that access from the user because a lack of people to separate the process. So it might be perfectly clean and fine for those users to have access. So that's where a mitigation would come into effect, where we would apply a business control that says we accept this risk and that we have a process behind the scenes ensuring that no untoward activity is taking place whilst that authorization is assigned to users. Similarly, we have this broken down. So we have it broken down by the overall risk rating. We also have it broken down by business process. Unfortunately, my demonstration system does not have a full list of trends, but this would be a monthly trend report showing you, in January, have you decreased into February, or are you on an upward trend where there are new access assignments that are actually creating new violations. And typically that's actually what we see with organizations that may go through a remediation process to begin with, but actually do not apply further governance behind the scenes to do continual checks of authorization. So we would see a gradual increase in those violations, even after some initial remediation may have been done. So just to finish off on a few of the navigations on the tool itself. So on the left-hand side, we have all of our key areas. So we have our advanced analysis. We can have a look at our rulebook later, our activity history that we've run for the user, and the configuration aspects. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to dive into the actual detail of the access risk itself. And this form is fully integrated. So if we can interact with this, it'll actually open up all of those users who have an access risk that are in the partially executed, let's say, bucket of analysis. So we can see here we have our users. We can see that the risks that they have. So if we just click here, we can see a bit of a description of what that risk actually is that's defined within the system. And we can see what rating we have, what is our business process, do we currently have a mitigating control for it, and then we can also see, which is what's very important, the power of the tool is where our executions took place. So we can actually see here for this segregation of duty, that the user is maintaining purchase orders, but they're actually not maintaining any material master data. So we have a zero usage. Now, if you wanted to drill this down and find out a little bit more information of what that's actually doing, we can go to our transaction level details for our user and for that particular risk. We just drill down here, we can now start to see the transactions themselves that are actually assigned to this user that's creating the violation. We can see the usage against those individual transactions. We can also see the roles, which are also assigned to the user, which are creating this. So we have a singular role that is providing both ME21N and ME22N. And we actually have 3 different roles that are providing access to MMO2. However, there is no usage against MMO2 that's been found by the system. Now, I mentioned before about one of the key features of the tool is about kind of leading you to the change itself and actually providing with some recommendations for remediation. So we can actually have a look at the recommendations for this user. And what that's actually going to do is it's going to show us, based on the analysis performed by the system, that we should be deprovisioning this appears to be a directly assigned role to the user because there is no transaction activity taking place. And of course, it is also creating a higher violation as well as 2 other medium or low violations for the user as well. So we're able to kind of quickly get some quick wins to understand, you know, and start reducing the overall risk volume that we have. Okay. Now, if we just go back to our front screen here, we can have the same level of analysis at user level, but we can also have it at role level as well. So roles themselves, or certainly single roles or derived roles, whatever you want to call them, they actually should not, by default, have an inherent risk assigned to them, because whenever that risk is active within the role, wherever that role is assigned to, it's going to bring the risk. So you're not going to be able to have control over who's getting what risk. So if we just take some examples here, again, we can see, you know, what roles are creating these violations, you know, what transaction codes are also creating those violations as well. And for the role level, what's different at the user level is it's going to give us the combined usage of all users that are assigned to that role. So although for this particular role, we don't have any usage for this transaction code, it is part of a wider risk. So they're not using FV65, but they are using FV60. Okay. And again, like the users, we can also see role remediations as well. So we can start to see what changes should we be making to our initial roles that would help us in the resolution of removing and remediating some of our excess risks. So things like removing the transaction code from the role. We'll also get things like, you know, split the role into multiple roles. That's more not necessarily removing the risk from a user, but it's kind of establishing, you know, risk-free roles so that, you know, when they are assigned, it's in a much more controlled way, and you're actually not creating the risk immediately. You may need to assign both, you know, the role that's been split back to the user, but of course it's in a much more controlled manner. It's not within a single role location. Now, this is the online reporting that's available. There is a lot of offline reporting as well via the OneClick Analysis reports or the advanced analysis. I'm just going to show you one of those today. So this is what we call the OneClick Analysis. So it's more of a visualization report of users and the transactions and risks that those users are actually receiving. So let's say we wanted to search for a particular user. Let's take this user here. And what we can do is we can then look at the risks that the user has, as well as the transactions that are causing those risks. And we can see, the one representing that they're using the transaction, the -1 green representing that they're not using the transaction. However, they do have the assignment. So kind of scrolling through this overall report, we see there's a lot of unnecessary access that's assigned to this particular user. And we can also see some examples here where, let's see, the maintaining of material master data versus requisitioning. They're actually not using any of the requisitioning transactions at all. However, they are using a select few from the material master data. Just another way to visualize that information that's kind of coming out of the tool. Of course, if you'd rather digest all of it all at once, then we also have the ability to do so. So just going back into the tool, so we've kind of covered a little bit about the risk analysis itself and some of the remediation. One of the key activities that we can do is also simulate a future change. So this is part of best practice governance for the future, your future assignments, where we can say we have a new user joining the organization, or we have an existing user who's moving or needs some new access assigned to them. What we can do is we can simulate what would be the change for that particular user. So simulate a particular user, and we'd like to simulate adding a new role to them or adding a transaction to a role, and what impact on the risks would that actually have. So we could remove existing roles. Is that going to provide us with the remediation that we expect? Or if we add new roles, is that going to create any new risks? And this is something that should be applied in pretty much every day-to-day operational part for secure provisioning for users. And I ran one earlier, so we're just going to take a look at the output of running a what-if simulation for users. So what we can see here immediately is that we've made a change to the user, or stated we are going to make a change to the user. And we can see here that the source was saying that this user is going to now receive these risks, and it's been caused by the changes that we've actually applied. And we can see a little bit more detail here of that extract, where we can see more information about what are the risks, what are the activities. Oh, no, sorry, I'm in the wrong one here. See the what if analysis. So we can actually see the changes that have been caused by that new role assignment that we're about to do. And of course, we can also see what are the particular privileges or transactions that are going to be creating that new conflict for that user. So that's our simulation. Of course, all analysis starts with risk definition. Within ERP Maestro, there are around about 250 risks, I think. Majority of them being segregation of duties. However, there are a significant number of sensitive transactions as well, and this could be for financial accounting or basis style transactions. And like I said, this is where we define the rule set, and there is an out-of-the-box rule set that comes with ERP Maestro. However, we can modify this rule set, and it's always recommended that you at least take a look at the rule set, remove risks that maybe are not applicable to your organization, or add additional custom transactions that you may also have maintained within your application as well, because ERP Maestro is not going to know about those. So you see here we're looking at a particular risk of basis development and configuration. And if we look at one half of the risk, which is for system config, we can see here that the transactions that are defined within that risk, and also we can see the activities that are associated with that risk as well. We can apply additional parameters which are not in the rule set that might be specific to you. So for example, if you wanted to run risks against a company code or a plant or a particular purchasing organization, they can be added separately as well. moving on to our access reviewer. So this is where we can say trigger off the review of maybe what users and what roles they have assigned to them, what risks that they're creating today. We can define, when that's going to take place. Do we want to, if we've run a review multiple times, we can actually say only include any system changes since the last time we did a review. So we don't have to go through the whole thing again. And typically, what an access review is going to look like is, we're going to see the user content, we're going to have our decision making, are we going to keep that access, are we going to remove it, what roles are assigned, what risk violations those roles contain, and obviously what transactions that user has been using. And on the emergency access management side as well, this is where we're assigning this additional role-based authorizations to users to use as a temporary activity. So we have one for basis extended access. We have our owners, our approvers. We put in our reasoning and obviously submit that for overall approval. And once we've actually finished with our access, what we get is we get a report very similar to this, where we would see all transactions that were executed by the user at the time whilst they were logged in under their account. We can see if those transactions were assigned either as part of their standard access or elevated access. So if we just look at those that are elevated, we care about, and maybe we only care about those that are sensitive, we can see here what were the transactions that were run at the time. We can also see any system changes that were made as well. So it's not about the transaction execution, it's also about were any modifications made, so that we can validate that, again, that was applicable based on what the user was trying to achieve at the time. Okay, so that really concludes our very swift ERP Maestro demonstration. So what we're going to do is we're just going to finish up by just having a look at S/4HANA. So in partnership with ERP Maestro, we have developed a methodology, let's say, where you can get the best value from an ERP Maestro or an SAP Access Control by applying some simple logic as part of your S/4HANA implementation. So these are things like being prepared to move so that before you actually start designing your future roles, that your existing application is clean, because you don't want to be transitioning that risk into your new environment. Of course, that's primarily applicable for those companies who are already on SAP moving to S4. Now, as part of the design process, it's running frequent risk analysis to check and validate that the design that's being built is not going to create additional risk violations. So you kind of keep that under control during your design phase, and of course also through into your build phase as well, so that you're building these kind of risk-free roles and trying to mitigate the risk as much as possible prior to go live. You'd use things like emergency access for go live, and then of course once you're actually live on the system, a continued process for access review and also continued risk analysis is recommended. And that'll be about it for today's webinar. I think we're okay on time, so hope everyone has understood the webinar today and learned something from today's session. Just a couple of things just to close on from my perspective. During September and October, we're actually offering a free proof of concept for ERP Maestro. So if you're new in the space and would like to understand your access risks, what we can do is we can connect ERP Maestro to a system of your choosing. It could be QA or production. We'll run the risk analysis and we can present to you back the results and the findings of the actual risk analysis itself, and so we can get you hands-on with and understand some of the features. Also, over the next couple of months, we're going to be running some more webinars. So we'll have a webinar in October, which is centered towards the GRC Access Control 12.0 upgrade. And we'll actually have a solution demonstration of access control, possibly process control and risk management as well as part of that session. And then in November, it'll be much higher focus on UI masking and logging, where again, we'll get hands-on in the system. So obviously unable to show you something in the system today, but hopefully we'll be able to show that in the future. So thanks everyone for your time, and have a great rest of the day.